Emily from Homemade Emily Jane. Today I want to show you exactly how to use an AccuQuilt GO fabric cutting machine to cut out pieces for your next quilt project. If you're curious about different AccuQuilt models, the one that I'm using is an AccuQuilt GO. It's a hand crank machine, but it works pretty similarly to the AccuQuilt GO Big, which is an electric version of it, or the AccuQuilt Me, which is a smaller hand crank model. So a lot of what I share today will be applicable to both of those. If you're curious about fabric cutting machines in general, check out this video up above that compares two different types of fabric cutting machines and will help you pick out which one is the best for you and the projects that you have in mind. Before we get started talking about the AccuQuilt GO, I want to invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel and also be sure to check out homemadeemilyjane.com. All right, let's get started. Before you start actually cutting out your fabric for your next quilt project using your AccuQuilt, it's a good idea to plan out your quilt. AccuQuilt offers all kinds of different resources, free patterns, ideas, inspiration to help you get started with this. And one of my favorite tools is the AccuQuilt GO Quilt software. It's completely free and it's on their website, and I'll put a link in the description below. Another really cool way to plan out a quilt is to use a mix and match cube in your choice of size and make blocks based on one of those. So if you're unfamiliar with a cube, there's a lot you can do with it. It's a set of dies. It contains 8 different dies that come together perfectly to make hundreds of different types of blocks. I personally have the 8-inch cube and the 12-inch cube, and I love them both and really can't pick a favorite. So if you like smaller piecing, I would suggest getting a smaller size cube. Or if you like quicker, faster, bigger piecing projects, go ahead and get one of the larger size cubes. You really can't go wrong. So once you have an idea of what your quilt is going to look like, what colors you need, how many fabrics you're going to use, we'll go ahead and start gathering our supplies. So in order to start cutting your fabrics, you will need your fabric, you will need your AccuQuilt cutting machine, you'll also need the dies that you'll be using and mats that match the size of your dies or are at least a little bit larger. Before we get started cutting our fabric, I'll go ahead and show you the supplies that I'll be using today in this video. First of all, my AccuQuilt GO cutting machine. It stores nice and upright with a handle so I can move it, and then when I'm ready to use it, I just open it up like so, and then it has a hand crank on the side here which runs the dies through the rollers. The dies that I'll be using are part of the 8-inch mix and match cube, which actually came with my machine in the Ready Set Go set, which I definitely recommend, and I will throw a link in the description below. If you shop through my affiliate links, it helps me out, so I appreciate your support. So the dies that I'll be using are all here. Once you come up with your plan, you'll know exactly which dies to use and how many to cut of each fabric. And then of course you'll need a cutting mat as well. So if you're using a cube, it comes with, inside this little specialty booklet set, it has the correct size cutting mat. If you're ordering other dies that might not come with a mat, be sure to check and see if it comes with it, or just order your mat separately. It's helpful to have a couple extra laying around too. Now before I actually get started cutting my fabrics with AccuQuilt, I like to do some prep work first. So you'll see here I've got my fabric, but it needs to be pressed, and so I have a spray bottle. I actually have Best Press in my spray bottle, but you could use any kind of starch or even homemade starch is great too. And then I also have a nice hot iron. So I'll give it a little mist and then iron it, and it's a good way to prep your fabric before running it through the machine. I personally prefer the misting method of starching because I feel like it gives just a nice thin layer over coat. People starch it differently, so I would say just find what method works best for you. As long as it's nice and flat, it should run through the AccuQuilt machine just fine. It's important to note that the dies that you're running through the machine, the blades are actually on the die crooked on purpose. So they're at a slight angle so that when you run it through the rollers of the machine, it's not hitting a speed bump, and instead it can glide over at an angle. One thing that you can do that will help keep your fabric on grain later on is to actually draw on your dies with a permanent marker like I've done here. You can draw about a 1/4 inch line around the sides of the dies and then use your lines to match up your fabric with later on. So I'll go ahead and do it to this die now. If you are cutting a lot of fabric, it might be helpful to cut it down into what I like to call rough cut strips. These strips that I cut are about a 1/2 inch larger than the actual blades on the die that I'm cutting for the particular shape to give it a little bit of wiggle room. And it doesn't really matter if they're super precise because you're going to use the machine to cut your perfect pieces later on. All right, it's time to start actually cutting your fabric. One of the ways that you can handle cutting a lot of yardage at once is to bunch up the fabric next to the die as you feed it through the machine, or to fold it over just kind of to the side of the die. But one of the things that I like to do, it's kind of an extra step, but for me it makes it easier, is I'll do rough cut strips. So for this one, it's 3 inches from this side to this side. So if I'm using this die, I will cut 3-inch strips, which I've done here. I've got 2 of them to show you. So I'll go ahead and feed these strips through the machine, and to me it just makes it a lot easier and like less to worry about. So now I will line up the fabric with the edge of the die and put my mat on top, and I'm currently cutting 4 layers. I've got some selvage I want to make sure is not part of the shape. So now I'll put my mat on top. Anyway, as long as it covers all of the blades that you want to cut, and then feed it through the machine. Once your die comes out the other side, you can easily take the mat off by sliding it. Push down a little and slide it off, and it'll keep your fabrics in place, and then you have a clean mat coming off. If you lift the mat directly up, it'll bring the fabric with it, and it can just get kind of messy. So now you'll be able to gently tear off the strips. I have a little bit of string that's caught. It's helpful to keep a pair of scissors handy, just for any extra snips that you might need. So for this one, I had 2 little problem areas, just little tiny pieces. And now we can go ahead and take our pieces off of the die. And next we'll run it through the machine again. So we have a couple options here. We have some tails. I find it easy if I have my scissors out, just snip them, and then I have a trash can right here next to my mat. I can throw them out and start with a very clean piece to run through the machine again. You don't have to trim them off, that's just an option for me. I find that this keeps everything really neat and tidy, but of course it's not necessary. So then we slide it off. What we can actually do as well is we can run it through the machine the opposite direction. So I'll go ahead and line it up here, put the mat on, and then we will crank backwards and feed it through the machine that way. Slide it off, and that was nice and clean. So we'll go ahead and take these, set them down, and then line it up again. And this is where the tails get kind of in the way, so we'll feed them through. And as you can tell, it's just pretty rhythmic. You do the same steps back and forth, until you get to the end of your strip. When you're done, you'll have some really tiny scraps. I like to go ahead and chop off the bigger pieces like these and save them, and then these little guys I'll just throw out. Another way you can layer your fabric before you put it through the machine is through using a fan fold. Using a fan fold is a really cool method if you need a lot of pieces but not a whole strip's worth or only a few pieces. So you can really find out what works best for you based on the pattern that you've chosen to use. Now let's say you want to do a fan fold version. So instead of using strips and lots of layers, you can do a fan fold. And for this one, I'm using a fat quarter and I'm actually going to fold it in thirds. So it has now 3 layers and it's nice and straight. This is an option also if you don't want to do rough cuts because this will feed through the machine nice and evenly. So now I'll grab my die. Just make sure that things are straight and that all 3 layers nicely cover all areas of the die. So that part involves a little bit of manual checking, but for this one I've got plenty of room. And I'll go ahead and try to get it as on grain as possible using the lines. Place your mat on top and then you can feed it through. You'll see that came off nice and even. I now have 12 little 2.5-inch squares just from that one little pass through the machine. Next I'll do the same thing with a different die here. But this one I do need 6 layers. So this is where things get kind of fun. I can line it up and then fold it over. So I will get 6 layers out of this one piece. Make sure it covers everything on all sides. We don't want any partial pieces here. And then feed it through. Now it has 6 layers, so it's a little harder to crank here. But we did it. Slide the die off and then it comes off nice and clean, and then you can inspect your pieces. Make sure that everything came out looking good. Nice and clean, nice and even. Perfect little quarter triangles. And then this is what your fat quarter looks like when you're done. What I'll do is just use my scissors and snip off these little pieces. And then I'll keep this chunk for scraps later on, and then I'll throw out this little netting that we just created. So now I've got lots more fat quarters to do that on, so I will keep cutting away. You'll see once you get started, it can go really quickly and it can be really fun, and you can just knock out cutting a bunch of pieces really fast, which is why I love AccuQuilt, and I hope you do too. Thank you so much for watching this video about how to use an AccuQuilt GO. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you might be inspired to try using AccuQuilt on your next project. I personally really love mine. If you want to learn more about AccuQuilt or check out some of my other quilt patterns and tutorials, be sure to check out homemadeemilyjane.com, and of course subscribe to my YouTube channel so you can see me here more often.